Hello, everybody, and welcome to Politics Relaxed. It's been an interesting week for what would normally be a very quiet recess because Nicola Sturgeon has decided to resign from her position as First Minister, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I mean, we've got two people in Scotland, which is very exciting. Finlay and Rajan are both currently posted across the border, so I'm sure we're going to get some unique insights as always. I mean, let's get started. Does anybody want to start?
Well, I think that after 8 years of serving as First Minister, I am glad that she has recognised that now is the time to go. We have to recognise also that her time as leader was most recognised in a campaign for separation, and that's exactly what we don't want. I think now the SNP government must come back and put this decade of division behind us and stop the push for a second independence referendum and focus on the priorities, the real priorities of the Scottish people.
Well, I mean that yeah, they're just not going to do that though. The push
Yeah.
for a second independence is what defines pretty much their entire policy. So that is bound to continue. They have. I'm expecting polling to dip for them, and towards Labour in the next few weeks, just as it tends to be with when a long-term leader resigns. And she has been around for a while, 8 years. What she's accomplished in those 8 years, I think, is a different matter because I mean, um, it's difficult to find to find concrete accomplishments in some areas, particularly with perhaps what was the long term goal of the SNP government, which is to establish a firm base in support of independence, which just has not emerged at all in Scotland. And there have definitely been significant failures in, particularly influential areas of life, such as in Scottish health and education, are still struggling, often lagging behind other parts of the UK. And so yeah, that's part of the issue with
Yeah.
why she resigned, I think.
Mm.
I think there's no doubt that we've, in this past week, we've lost probably one of not just Scotland, but the UK's most important politicians of the past 10 years. And I think, especially coming from, because I'm in Scotland right now, Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP kind of dominated political discourse. So I think it's going to be quite weird seeing someone else, in that top role. But I think as the SNP are technically the party, a single issue party of independence, I think when you sum up a leader's tenure, particularly in relation to that single issue, you judge them by how well they were meant to advance that argument. And if we were to summarize how Nicola Sturgeon's done, I think, I guess, very poor is kind of an understatement. She's not managed to advance the argument on independence further than vote in 2014. You may have this argument about, polling and that, but polling's very low at the minute for Scottish independence, I've just seen. And then we can move on to what she's done in office. And, I take the view that she's been marked by so many mishaps, failures. Piers touched on education, for example. She set out in 2015 to, I guess, close the attainment gap in Scotland. That's not happened. The NHS right now is in crisis. I know it's in crisis everywhere in the UK, but in Scotland it's particularly bad. And even something as small as just the roads at the minute, I mean, full of potholes. Councils are not doing anything to sort that. It's just it goes from as high as education to as low as potholes here. That's how bad Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP have been for Scotland for, I guess, what is it now, over 15 years.
I think I agree with everything Finley said, although I do have a bit of sympathy for the SNP on the potholes issue because we're suffering a lot from potholes down in the south as well. I think it's related to the fact that there was a particularly cold winter, particularly extended periods of time, minus negative Celsius, and so obviously freeze-thaw weathering. I'm sure we all did that in GCSE geography. But no, what I want to say, and the more important issue of Sturgeon is I'm delighted to see the back of her, to be honest. As obviously a unionist, she had me a little bit scared from time to time because she's such a powerful figure. And obviously, she did achieve some success in winning over a great deal of the Scottish population for the argument of independence. But I think I'm delighted to see that in recent months that's declined and declined, and right now polling's generally showing around 45% support for independence, which for the first time is obviously a minority. So I'm delighted about that. And I think that's a big part of the reason why Nicola Sturgeon has gone. I think that she's no longer the strongest person to lead that independence cause. However, what I find interesting is that there is obviously no clear frontrunner to take up that mantle. The big sort of name we've heard around is obviously a little bit tainted by the fact that she's been slightly on the wrong side of the culture wars debate because of her religion and what she said about abortion and the trans rights issues. So it'll be interesting to see how that all materializes. But look, I mean, the truth is that over the last few years, Sturgeon took her eye off the ball, and she's failed the people of Scotland as a result of her constant distraction with trying to gain independence, so that she was able to fulfil her life's dream and to put her name in the history books. And so as a result, the big issues in terms of Scotland have been left behind massively. And you can see it if you go to Scotland, you can walk around the streets, you can talk to people, and these are the issues people are facing. The number of drug deaths has tripled. That is a big issue that is impacting lots of people's families. It's impacted my family in Scotland as well, and so I have a big personal concern with that. And also, if you look at health and education more generally, the highest funding per capita of the UK provided by Westminster. Of course, the blame is always on Westminster. I've repeated this stat so many times, but Westminster is not to blame. The fact is they have the lowest performing NHS, the lowest performing education system. You look at the PISA scores, the international comparisons for maths and science. Scotland's recorded its lowest in decades in the last year. So, that's a demonstration of the disappointing performance of the SNP in those key areas and how they took their eye off the ball under Sturgeon. And hopefully they can get their eye back on the ball. But I'd rather just see the Scottish Conservatives installed.
I mean, it's quite interesting you touched on there. There's no clear front runner. I think when you have such a figure like Sturgeon, one that is inevitably a very successful politician, I mean, she is a very effective politician as well, and it leaves behind a bit of a vacuum when you have these big figures inside of a party that are there for such a long time, and then you almost don't have anybody kind of to turn to when Nicola Sturgeon says, all right, well, I'm stepping down now. And I mean, they've just changed leader in Westminster as well. This is a weak time for the SNP because, I mean, no one really knows that much about what's coming next. And it's a time where they're going to really have to shape what the next 5 years looks like under the SNP and what they want to focus on. Because, I mean, obviously they're going to put independence first, as that's in the name, right? But other than that, what else are they gonna focus on? Because, as everybody's mentioned, there have been significant failings in policy in Scotland for a while now. And who's going to be the person that takes over and tries to deal with those?
Look, I'm of the opinion that, well, obviously the SNP over the past 15, I guess, longer that if you want to argue, it's been dominated by two figures, Nicola Sturgeon, obviously, and then Alex Salmond. But I think going into the future, it doesn't almost matter if the SNP kind of have that caliber type of politician, because they've already got the majority support of Scotland, of the Scottish electorate anyway, due to them being the main independence party, which is, I think, kind of in itself a problem because they've been put there as the governing party of Scotland simply for the fact that they support independence, and their public services record is horrible. They've caused numerous issues relating to, I mean, even the recent transgender debate has only managed to fuel division within the electorate and actually turn support away from them. So I hope we're a bit far away from, I think 2024 is the next time Scottish seats are up in an election. So it's a long way away from them, but I hope that the Scottish voters kind of take into account all that's happened recently. And I guess the whole time that the SNP has been in power and kind of just get them out, really. I mean, I don't even care who gets it out. I just think the SNP has been one of, if not the worst things to happen to Scotland politically for time and time again now.
I think what's really interesting as well is we talked about the leadership situation, and I mentioned the front runner who I think will probably get it is Kate Forbes. But if you look at the polls at the moment, 69% of the Scottish people actually don't know who they think should succeed. And then there's a range of candidates, your Forbes, your Humza, Yousaf, whatever, and they tend to be around 6 to 7%. No one has more than 7% support from the Scottish people. And I think that should be of great concern to the SNP, because it shows that they haven't done well enough in performing a proper education to the Scottish people of what their government is about. And I think this leads into a further point about that I think Finlay was starting to make, which is that the performance of the SNP is so disappointing. And that's why I think it's concerning that the Scottish people have been unable to open their eyes and to judge the government on their performance. And hopefully that's the situation we can get to, because the fact is, I mentioned healthcare and education, and you look at, for instance, taxes as well. The income tax bands they both start at a lower rate and they're 1% higher than in England. So there's a lot of concerns that the Scottish people should have when they look at these figures properly and this data, and they should use these metrics going into the next election. And the next election shouldn't be based on whether they want independence or not, because the fact is that neither a Conservative or a Labour government in Westminster is going to allow an independence referendum when we just had one in 2014. So I think it's really important that Scottish people get over that. And it is a minority of Scottish people now who are calling for independence, and I think that they need to get over it. And the majority need to ensure that the SNP government do not win a further majority in another election.
I'm not sure you can just tell them to get over it. I'm not sure that's a particularly effective way of going about things.
Well, the way that they're considering things at the moment, the Scottish government's performance has impacted the Scottish people in a negative way, and they are being blindsided by the independence argument, which is exactly what the SNP want.
I think as well, we need to kind of educate more people about the consequences of independence, because we're just talking about the SNP's failures as a government at the minute. The kind of downsides to independence for people like me in Scotland is catastrophic economically, and this is the kind of the problem that I can't get over, is that we're so close to becoming an independent country. If you had, say, we took a step back and had this argument a year ago, if we were to have a referendum then, I think we would have left, and then the consequence of that would be catastrophic. I'm glad that the SNP have mucked up to an extent that people are starting to question, but what we need now is to not kind of fuel division by using polarizing language that we've seen over the past couple of years. We need to educate people into seeing that there is an alternative to a government that's been there for 10, 15 years, and it's the job of the parties in opposition in Scotland to prove that.
It's never, because I think the key problem is we were having a discussion yesterday to say that Labour and the Conservative Party are both parties that get sucked into Westminster. If we're talking about the general voter, would they, all they see is an independence party who are solely based in Scotland, which is the SNP, and then you have two other parties who can get distracted by Westminster. Some were saying is if there were to be a unionist, solely Scottish unionist party that did arise, then they could mount the challenge, because a lot of Scottish people don't care about what happens in Westminster. just to be in Scotland. I mean, that's why the two UK parties are having problems in Scotland. But
Okay,
yes,
what I would say, sorry to expand your point a little bit, Rajan, is um, in 2021 in the Scottish parliamentary election, Douglas Ross offered to do a deal with the other unionist parties, and he was turned down. So look, there's a total willingness from the Conservative and Unionist Party to form sort of electoral pacts in order to defeat the Nationalist Party. But look, from my perspective, that's what I want to see. I want to see in the Scottish parliamentary elections, not in general elections, but in the Scottish parliamentary elections, I want to see unionists properly unite in order to defeat the nationalists, which I think could be done in a magnificent way. But what I would say in terms of the parties in particular is we're talking a lot now about the Labour Party in Scotland. I don't really understand why, because it's the Conservative and Unionist Party that are the real threat to the SNP. It's demonstrated week in, week out if you watch First Minister's questions. And if you look at the seats in Holyrood, clearly the Conservatives have 31 and Labour have 22. So it's clear what way true unionists in Scotland should turn in order to win the next Scottish parliamentary election, and that is to the Conservative and Unionists.
Look, I think a lot of the reason why the SNP has been able to survive in Scotland is that they've relied on, I guess, anti-Tory rhetoric. A lot of their policies have been on, look, we're doing the opposite of what Westminster is doing. Doesn't matter at all, but we hate them so much. You should vote for us. I don't buy into the idea that the Conservatives will be able to win in Scotland. It's just like, if you look at electoral history, I don't think the Scottish Conservatives have been in power since about the 1950s. So I'm not really buying into that idea. But
yeah.
I think that this point about unity between the unionist parties, I think, is important, because going back to that point about rhetoric, is that the Labour and Conservatives are at the polar opposites in terms of policy and whatnot at the moment. But if they can unite specifically in Scotland towards a campaign of independence, be united in terms of pushing forward the idea of the union, then look, I think we could see the SNP's influence reduce dramatically.
I think there's a risk of getting carried away a little bit with this idea of all the unionist parties uniting and all becoming friends for Scottish parliamentary elections, which is a little bit unrealistic, because at the end of the day, the Scottish Parliament isn't just a referendum on whether Scotland wants to stay in the Union or not. It's a much bigger thing than that. They have control over significant areas of policy, and it's not going to be realistic to see any sort of genuine coalition in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, possibly you can have resources focused on certain seats and not focused on other seats. I mean, that makes sense to me, but anything further than that, I'm not sure there's a realistic chance of it happening.
I take your point, Felix, and it's not my preference for a parliamentary election to turn into an independence referendum. That's the whole thing that we're trying to avoid in the first place. The whole thing that the unionists want to avoid. But what I would say is that for so long as the SNP peddle this narrative, to an extent, we're going to have to play to their tune, because they are the party in government. And it's our responsibility to get them out. And if you look at Scotland as a collective, there are a lot of unionists there. Unfortunately, they are disadvantaged by the electoral system in terms of the constituencies. But if people properly were able to band together, I think there are ways that the SNP could be defeated, and I think that's what's got to happen. The Conservatives and Labour in Scotland can work together. I do believe that. They can put their differences aside and they can work together. It's just whether the Labour Party would be happy to do that given the Westminster circumstances.
But how specifically would you see that happening? I'm just a little confused exactly what that would look like.
Well, I think that what was proposed in 2021 referred to sort of an electoral pact to an extent, which unfortunately didn't materialise, which could have included, for instance, parties not standing candidates against other unionist candidates. And look, as I say, my preference is not that that's the way we go. I want the next parliamentary election to be focused on the Scottish government's continuous failings. I want the Scottish Conservatives to win the election on the basis of their very strong policies in relation to healthcare, education, in reference to drug deaths. These are the big issues that unfortunately Scottish people aren't able to focus on because of the dominance of the independence debate.
I think it's unfortunate that Scottish politics has been reduced to this one single issue, but it's the SNP who set the debate and have managed to change the goalposts to get to a situation like this. I mean, look, whatever happens, I don't think, given all the scandals that have happened this year, you could say that it'll be really hard for the Scottish Conservatives to present an argument that's attractive to Scottish voters, even due to that nature of SNP peddling anti-Tory rhetoric, for example, and it's quite high. I think Labour personally have the best chance due to Scotland being more predominantly a kind of working class left wing country. But yeah, I do see some strength in the Electoral Pact kind of idea that Cameron mentioned.
I mean, it does open a door for Labour to come back in, because Labour used to be dominant in Scotland before 2015, really, and they've really struggled since then in general elections because of the lack of support in Scotland. But we also know that the SNP aren't invincible in general elections now, because they did lose seats in 2017 before regaining them in 2019, and they lost most of them to Labour. With the resigning of Sturgeon, and the particularly low points for the SNP, and Labour is increasingly polling higher in Scotland as well, particularly in the the dense urban areas like Glasgow and surrounding industrial areas, that those will, I think, go to there will be a shift to Labour in the next election, or at least that's where it's looking.
I think it's also important to mention that they're doing better. I mean, Anna Sala, I think, is a very strong leader in Scotland, and will hopefully take Labour up in the next general election in Scotland and the Scottish Parliament elections, because he is a very strong leader, and I think he would make, I mean, you never know in the future, a very good First Minister if it got to that stage. And this is a big opportunity for Scottish Labour, I think, to capitalise on the SNP, who are in a pretty weak position, losing their leader in Westminster and now in Scotland. It's a very good time for Scottish Labour to take advantage of that and really pitch out a strong proposal for the Scottish people. Thank you very much to you guys for coming on. As always, thank you to you for watching the video. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you very soon.